So unfortunately, there's no coffee break, but fortunately, there's the next session, which will be on the way from PhD to full professor. So as many of you know, we have seen it this morning already that the numbers of females in STEM is quite low. And also what we observe is that on the whole career, in academic careers, all over the career, the percentage of women is going down if you start from PhD to postdoc to assistant professor and so on up to full professor. And so I'm delighted to now introduce our invited speaker for this session, who will be Geraldine Fitzpatrick. And she's full professor at TU Vienna, where she's heading the team on human-computer interaction. And she has received many awards, including Distinguished ACM Scientists and Speaker. Being originally from Australia, she earned a PhD at Queensland University, but she also holds a degree in psychology, in particular coaching psychology, and she's very, very much engaged in career development. So please welcome Geraldine.
Thank you, Steve. So, I am between you and coffee or lunch. And I'm really happy to be here, and I think it's so exciting what is happening here. It's so important. And what I think I want to talk about is that I think there is a much better PhD to professor path that we can aspire to if we can look at how to have more enabling structures and systems, and if we can look at how to create more supportive environments in our local areas. And we've just already seen some of the issues that will connect, so there'll be a nice red thread. And I also want to add to that somehow empowering us, enabling us as individuals to define what is a good academic life for us, because I think that's also a big part of this path from PhD to professor. I want to acknowledge that there's a diversity of genders and gendered experiences, and I will be shorthanding to women here. And I also want to just acknowledge that many of the literature that I will reference have used very binary notions of gender. But nonetheless, there's still, I think, interesting things to point to. So I should just position myself, given that this is about PhD to professor. So Steve already said that I did a PhD in computer science, but before that I was a nurse and a midwife. After I finished my PhD, I worked in a research centre as a researcher in Australia, then moved to the UK to work in industry as a user experience consultant, fell into a job in Sussex University as a senior lecturer, fell into another job at TU Vienna where I am now. My research area is human-computer interaction, and as you can see from, and I also have more recently completed the Masters in Applied Positive Psychology, Coaching Psychology. So I've never had a career plan or a career path as such. It is a serendipitous scenic walk as a path. And as Steve indicated as well, by the academic egg counting that we all have to somehow report to, I've done okay. And thanks to working with amazing people, amazing collaborators, and lots of serendipitous opportunities as well. Again, like people who might have been here on Monday heard Linda Hardman talk, and she also talked about lots of ways in which things just happened, and then you make sense of them looking back. But behind that sort of academic-facing facade, there's a whole lot of other stuff going on. So yes, I'm a woman in computer science, but I feel even more marginalised because I'm doing HCI. So in terms of gaining legitimacy in computer science, I'm sort of a minority of a minority. And it's really hard, and I know that this isn't just my experience, it's the experience of lots of people who do HCI, men and women. I'm a first generation higher ed person. My parents didn't even go to high school. So, the imposter and I have been very good friends throughout my career, and it's actually been part of many of the decisions that I made and didn't make, actually. I also do qualitative research, so at least I could be an HCI person who coded or built interactive prototypes, but I don't. I do more qualitative research. So, even within, so there's minority of a minority of a minority. And we heard about cognitive differences and things before as well. I remember when we did, when I was in the research centre, they brought in some consultants and we did some sort of profiling with people in the group, and the profile, labelled people or positioned people along this sort of scale of 1 to 10. And the consultant got us all to stand at where our results put us. And all of my technical computer science colleagues were up here, and long gap, and then there was me. So, even in that sort of style, in terms of just, we're diverse in so many ways. And then there are all of the different challenges and issues that you deal with at every step of the way, the stresses that you deal with, the challenges of moving into different cultural contexts. I inherited some projects that I shared some about on Monday. And then moving to Austria, and just the issues about not being part of the dominant language group. And I know, I know that this is the experience for so many people, but as a spoilt brat English speaker, this is, it's been a real eye-opener about the ways in which, you feel very marginalised within a dominant speaking culture. And just different ways of working. So there are a whole lot of things that underpin our stories in our PhD to professor path. And I could tell stories about those things in detail for ages. And you would all have those stories as well. I also want to acknowledge that being a woman has also had some advantages working in computer science, because I know that sometimes I've been asked to be the token woman, dragged out, waved, tick in the box. But nonetheless, some of those token woman opportunities have enabled me to make networks. They have been important entries into my CV that might have contributed to promotions and so on. The challenge is managing the number of token women requests you get so that you're not overwhelmed. So I want to just summarise the challenges that you all know, so I'm not going to spend much time on them, to then move to what I think we can do about it. So, the very point of why EUGAIN exists is because of these issues about, the biases in evaluations that we face. And we are all guilty of making the same biased judgments, whether we're male or female, according to a lot of the research. And we get that in research, in teaching, publications. We get it in workplace cultures, so just as an example, research that points to women being interrupted more. And that if a man is first to talk, women are less likely to talk. Various studies that talk about that. And we also know there's a whole lot of stuff about women doing an unfair, peer service citizenship load and paying the price for that. There's a whole lot of research about imposter, and I think syndrome is a bit problematic. It's a phenomenon that we may experience in different contexts or not. There's a whole lot of research that talks about women not promoting themselves in the same way as men. That's often tied in with the imposter as well. And as we saw in the data that was presented this morning, the underrepresentation at senior levels. But what I particularly want to draw attention to is what has been happening during COVID. And again, there have just been numerous research studies that point to the effect on women academics being disproportionate, and the biases and challenges in the system being magnified and amplified. And this is both in terms of publishing and productivity in work, as well as taking on even more of the invisible work. And that's both care in the home and care in our research groups, looking after people who are struggling. And I just thought it was interesting that even with Zoom, a study talked about women being disproportionately affected by Zoom fatigue. And we know that there are different issues that people face at all different points in their career. So, we know that by the time we get to professor and later into the career, that we do have much smaller numbers, as we saw, and some of there are diverse reasons for the dropouts at each point. For a lot of postdocs' early careers, it's really the precarious contracts situation and how able they might be to relocate to different countries in order to take up other jobs. We know that when people get onto the tenure track, if they're caught up in excessive service or at promotion at any level, from lecturer to senior lecturer and so on, if they get caught up in excessive service, when they come forward to their promotion, the faculty may have been really happy to have them as the curriculum coordinator for the last 3 years, killing themselves in that work. But then, despite the criteria talking about, 2 of 3 of research service, admin, teaching, being acceptable for promotion, if they don't have, we all know that if they don't have a stellar research publication profile, people struggle to get promoted. So there are barriers at each point, and they're complex. And we know that it also matters about your particular family context, cultural context. We heard about the issues about deciding when to have kids or not. It's a complicated picture. So, in thinking about where we might go with this, I want to first propose that I think it's really useful to reframe the challenge, because we often hear about these challenges more in terms of, how do we stop the leaky pipeline, or how do we retain women, and how do we have this sustainable pipeline coming through. And I want to invite us to reframe what we're aiming to do. So it's not about stopping or keeping, but it's about how can we create the most amazing, supportive cultures and processes that truly value diverse contributions and perspectives and are committed to developing individual potential. And if we can do that, as a natural consequence, we're going to stop a leaky pipeline. We're going to retain good people. And in fact, they're going to be better people because of being able to get this right. So my first point is thinking about how we frame the challenge or problem we're addressing actually matters, because it orients us to different things. There's a generative energy, power, I think, in framing it into what do we want, in terms of, more positive outcomes there. The other thing I want to just propose is that, and I'm not proposing it, this is reflecting the literature, is we talk about diversity, and we know that diversity is much more than just gender. There's, we've heard lots about this today. And however we define diversity, though, even if we are actually able to embrace, different learning styles, cognitive styles and so on, personality styles, sense of humour styles, diversity is just having a seat at the table. It's often just a tick box exercise. And that what we should be really aiming for is inclusion, like not just having a seat at the table, but how do people have a legitimate voice at the table? And not just a voice, but how do they have a voice that is equally valued and heard and respected, even if it's a different voice, so that it's an equal contribution. And these can be really challenging, really moving from diversity to inclusion and equity. And the reason why, we all know why it's so important, because, just to quote one, we understand that scientific excellence depends on creativity, creativity depends on diversity, and the advantages of diversity are realised through inclusion, and I would add equity to that. So this isn't just about creating nice environments or, having balanced numbers, tick, tick. It's about, and I don't think we want balanced numbers of men, women. I think we want rich, diverse communities, regardless of gender, of whole lots of different styles of thinking, of whole lots of different research approaches, of whole lots of different topics equally valued. And it's all for the benefit of excellent science. And in the challenges that we're dealing with today with technology, that's really, really critically important. So something that could be worth brainstorming is, what might diversity actually mean in terms of the dimensions of difference that we might want to encourage, and in the same way that we looked at, you looked at the learning styles of, the cognitive styles of how people taught, in what ways are our current practices oriented to one or other of a particular style and excludes others? So I think that there are multi-dimensional responses that, that we need to take. It's an and. I don't think there's a simple solution. And it needs a whole systems approach. And I'm not going to start with the individual, because too often with many of these things, and we heard about work-life balance, for example, today, often it's put down to the individual to deal with, and ignoring the problematics at the bigger systemic level. So I want to start at the system levels. We need to change what we value in our evaluations. So I'm sorry this is hard to read where I've got the links, but you can click on the links in the slide. So there are actually some really encouraging initiatives happening that some universities have signed up to, like the Declaration on Research Assessment, DORA, or the Leiden Manifesto, or in the UK a few years ago there was a report called Metric Tide that critiqued the evaluation metrics and the reliance on impact factors and H-indexes and so on. And the Nuffield Council report and the Dutch Research Council also have had a really interesting report put out around recognition and reward. And so how do we promote, this is from their brochure, how do we have recognition and reward structures that actually allow for different shaped academics and not the dominant shape, which is often a dominant, more male-oriented shape? So, what do we need to do to value those different contributions? And some practical examples in what's been proposed coming out of some of those. So the Nuffield report talked about the narrative CVs as one way of doing it. So rather than having a CV that just lists what you did, you actually get to account in a more narrative style about what your contribution is. Now, there's been more recent research that's talked about the ways in which we still have to work out how to make narrative CVs work, because when they were tried in a committee, the evaluators found it really hard to deal with. But nonetheless, it's really encouraging that it's a step in the right direction of people saying we should not be making these evaluation decisions just on numbers. We've got to look at the person and the context. I also want to, I'd love to see more of adding other evaluation criteria, because none of us do our research in isolation. We do it in collaboration with a whole lot of other people. And that the rhetoric of rising stars or the rock star researcher or the giving a research award to a single individual hides the fact that no one has achieved anything without a cast of thousands, and whether that's your direct collaborators or whether it's the people who volunteer to organise the conferences or be on the editorial board for a journal for your papers to get accepted, we only achieve with a whole lot of other people's input. And as we saw, women are often more involved in these service roles as well. So what can we do to make that sort of work more visible and rewarded? So, can we have a criteria that isn't just someone who's strong at research in their own right, but is strong at enabling other people to do good research? We've just done a round in I'm on the ACM Distinguished Members Review Panel, and we've just been doing current reviews, and what I find really sad there are a couple of people who are clearly critically important to enabling a whole community of other people to do excellent research, who wouldn't have done that research without this person, and yet there's debate in the panel because that person doesn't have an excellent H-index in their own right. So let's change those criteria. And something that's really encouraging is Glasgow University recently introduced collegiality as a specific criteria for anyone going for promotion or applying for a job. So how have you been collegial? How have you supported your peers? And that could be, I organised the lunchtime seminars for people, or I mentored people, or it could be all sorts of ways. I did a podcast interview with Tanita Kasky and Elizabeth Adams on the Changing Academic Life podcast, where they talk about this. And I just find that really, really encouraging. But it's not widespread. So how do we make this widespread? How do we embrace diverse contributions to making all of us do good science? In particular as well, I think we need to reconsider what we're doing after, I'm just looking at the time, we need to consider what we're doing post-COVID, or, are we ever going to be post-COVID? But how do we account for the gendered impacts of COVID? So what can we be doing in our institutions, in our systemic structures about contextualising people's metrics, CVs, outputs? How can we revisit faculty practices that might redistribute the service roles and waive service maybe for those who really got caught up in homeschooling? What can we do in our professional communities to counter the adverse impacts that many women and men, like many men in care roles, have also been reported in the research as having challenges? How do we promote this diversity, inclusion, equity? And we need to revisit the cognitive bias training that many faculties send their people off to, again, tick in the box, because the research says a cognitive bias training doesn't work and it often backfires. And what the research is starting to point to now is really about what do we do about changing culture, and its actionable strategies about, yes, we need that cognitive awareness, but how do we create new small habits in our everyday interactions, and how do we create cultures that reward those habits that go to more inclusive interactions? We can just discuss those in more detail. How do we need to rethink our everyday culture. So we saw in Larissa's talk about some of the issues that people had around, I can't remember what you said, but there are issues about communication styles or aggressive communication, and there's a lot of research about really aggressive meeting culture styles, toxic cultures, where people aren't happy to speak up. How do we change our faculty cultures to have more civil interactions with one another? How do we set everyday expectations about what's normal to work? If we see someone in the office at 6 o'clock, we should be saying, what are you still doing here? Not, I worked till 10 o'clock last night. How do we make invisible work more visible and accountable? And how do we actually share the load around more explicitly, like not just assume it happens? And how do we create environments that promote autonomy and trust. And there's a really interesting paper about creating a trust-based culture that results in all sorts of positive outcomes. And it's these sorts of behaviours that they talk about, you know, facilitating whole person growth in, you know, relationships, giving people discretion, recognising. That was something that came up this morning as well, people wanting to be recognised. We can do a lot for each other as peers. So how do we promote the peer network in role modelling that we've talked about, in encouraging the connections, in looking out for one another? So women are slow to self-promote. So why can we do more to say to someone, Paula, it's, you know, I think you'd do really well applying for this senior member award. Why don't you do it? Or helping people see the ways in which they could be more promoted, or promote one another. I think we need to do that much more for one another. There was a recent ACM Europe Awards webinar to try to do that. And then just in finishing is, I also just want to argue that if we can get these more supportive systems that have broader notions of diversity, and if we can get cultures that are actually inclusive and equitable, it will create more space for us, for everybody, to define what being a good academic is for them. Not to some external assessment of, you know, what your H index should be or how much grant money you should have, but what do you care about? What are your core values? What are you really good at? What difference do you want to make in the world? And how can we enable you to shape your career in that way? And for some people it may mean going to professor. For some people it may be staying at senior lecturer and being really happy. Like, there are no shoulds. How do we remove the shoulds? So, and there are some examples in the podcast series that I've done that are actually really nice role models of people who've made more value-based decisions for their careers and are really happy and been able to be productive regardless, despite some of the challenges. And I was just going to finish off just saying, you know, in sort of having my own journey from PhD professor has been much more about a journey buying into the fact that I can have my own definition of what it is to be an academic for me. That will look different, that does look different to lots of other people. So we can have a better path, and I look forward to seeing what comes out of the EUGAIN working group towards that. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Geraldine, for the talk. Really great. We're slightly running out of time, but I guess we can take a few short questions nevertheless. So, okay, Bara already has a question.
Yeah, just quickly, like, big thanks for a great talk. It was really inspirational. Many takeaways. Yeah, so many takeaways. Thank you for a great talk. I wanted to highlight one thing that you said about really valuing this collegiality, and I just wanted to bring one thing that I learned. There is a very nice book on managing for happiness by Jürgen Appelo, and there's a very nice thing that he says about when we think about how we want to reward people, we shouldn't think about their results but their attitudes. And I think this very nicely maps to what you said, and there are actually ways, because what they are saying, and it's very nice, that when you reward people for results, you teach them to cheat.
Yeah.
Because you teach them to achieve results, rather using the support of others, but to achieve results. Well, by rewarding them for attitudes, teaching them how to be a great team. And there are very nice techniques, actually, how to do that, by establishing ways for the people to kind of do peer acknowledgement. like setting up this like peer acknowledgement. So having the values, so for example, this collegiality, and say people, hey, like who you like to nominate this month for like being a great colleague to you for your personal experience. So like, and I think there is a lot to learn in the academic setup from this. So if you had some good example on this, how to promote this like valuing collegiality or other attitudes rather than results, I'll be happy to learn more.
That's just so important. Thank you for that. You know, that encouraging one another is, we can do so much, and it goes to, again, what we heard this morning. Now I'm confused about who said it, about learning, you know, the tinkering, the trying and learning and failing and learning. And our perfectionist selves often will stop us doing that tinkering because we're afraid to fail. And if we're only judged by, you know, like being one of the 25% papers accepted at a conference. So Janet Reed, again, one of the podcasts that I did, I learned so much from talking to the people for the podcast. So Janet Reed has this lovely example where she has, you know, runners, the finish line tape for an athletics carnival or whatever. If someone submits a paper or finishes a proposal, or, you know, sometimes, you know, could even be, we got to Friday, they'll put the finish tape across their doorway and they have to go through the finish tape to celebrate. So we should be celebrating the efforts, the big and small things. And when we're celebrating and acknowledging, we also need to be genuine, generous, and specific. So it's not just saying, thanks, you're a great colleague. But what the research says is it's so important that we say, thanks, you've been a great colleague. I really appreciated the way you did X and Y. So that being very, very specific. And that also helps people recognise what their own strengths are. And they go, oh, really? You know, because we've all got different strengths, and often when we have something as a strength, we don't recognise it because we just think everyone does it and it's just normal. So we can reflect, this lovely way of reflecting back and rewarding effort and recognising that we're in a learning journey, which means we only learn by failing and reflecting.
Hi, I am Ina Tejelīte from Riga Technical University. Thank you very much for your presentation, but I think from recommendations you are missing a very important point which could be deducted from your personal career, and that is international mobility. Because what we see from different kind of fields where women are successful, some of European countries, women are more open to be mobile, to move to other countries for new career challenges. And I think that we need to focus on this international dimension of mentoring. Mentoring was mentioned in the earlier session this morning, but also on using European Union instruments to advance careers, and especially in this step from PhD to professorship. In research, but also in mentoring and visiting professorships and so on. Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a great point as well. And I know that I have benefited a lot from international mobility, and a lot of that is because we weren't able to have children, despite trying. And if we had have had children, we would have made very different choices. And I would love to promote international mobility and the challenges and the benefits, and I would not want it to be the only path, because then it puts pressure on a whole lot of people who cannot be mobile, who choose not to be mobile, who prioritise as one of their own personal values being close to family as being more important than having a stupendous H-index. And so I would want to encourage one another to take advantage of those instruments and opportunities where you can, and especially if people are not doing it because they're afraid or worried about doing it, but also not pressuring people who are not in the situation, and not punishing them, not limiting their options because they can't travel. And there are many role models of people who've been able to do very well staying in their own location. So that could be an interesting research study for people who've been able to stay in their own situation, long term. What have they done to enable the effects of the international connections in terms of networking, even if they haven't been able to physically relocate and live somewhere else? So I think you've opened up a whole can of interesting worms there to discuss and explore.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we are really running out of time, unfortunately, but I guess you are around here for lunch, so maybe some questions can also go offline.
Yes.
Well, anyway, thanks a lot for your talk. Thanks once more.
Thank you. Thank you.